Welcome to the Food Revolution Summit, where we explore how you can heal your body and your world with food. I'm Ocean Robbins, and this next interview is with our guest, Andy Bellatti. Andy Bellatti, MSRD, is a Las Vegas-based dietitian with a plant-centric and whole foods focus, who takes an interest in food politics, food marketing, sustainability, and food justice. His work has been published in Grist, The Huffington Post, Today's Dietitian, and Civil Eats, among other publications, and he's frequently quoted in national and international media for his unique perspective on food and nutrition news. Andy is also the founder and was the strategic director of Dietitians for Professional Integrity, a group that advocated for ethical and socially responsible partnerships within the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. In the interview you're about to see, we'll be talking with Andy Bellatti about food politics and policies, as well as what you need to know to make informed choices about how to align your food life with your values. Andy, so great to be with you.
Likewise, thank you for having me.
So we know a lot about food and health today.
Mm-hmm.
We have tens of thousands of studies published in peer-reviewed medical journals telling us what's good for us and what's not. But we're fatter and sicker than ever. Why?
Well, a lot of that has to do with food policy and health policy and government policy in general that has an impact on a variety of issues, mainly agriculture, because a lot of the food that we eat, of course, is largely based on affordability, convenience, taste, flavor. So all of that comes back to policy. And so essentially what we have is an agricultural policy that makes it easier and more lucrative to grow crops that are then used to create what is known as ultra-processed foods. Ultra-processed foods are ones that are highly processed and therefore largely stripped of nutrition. But also what we know is that from a neurological standpoint, they trigger certain parts of the brain that can make those foods very addictive. So usually the combination of salt, sugar, and fat, or salt, starch, and fat. If you think of chips, there's your perfect example. There's a reason why it's so easy to go through an entire bag of chips in one sitting, whereas it's not as likely to, say, eat 7 apples in one sitting, because apples, they do have naturally occurring sugar, but they don't have the combination of that with fat and also salt, whereas a McDonald's apple pie will have that combination. So a lot of it comes down to the fact, though, that the foods that are the most addictive and the least nutritious also happen to be the most affordable because of government subsidies.
So take us behind, for the food industry, the processed food industry, why is it cheaper for them to take a food to a factory and strip it of all these things and repackage it in a bunch of ways? Like, I get that they're making things that consumers will be not able to stop eating. But they're also making more profit off of this than just selling us an apple.
Correct.
How does that work?
Well, largely it's because when you look at the main components or ingredients of these foods, you'll usually find derivatives of corn and soy. Now, eating fresh corn or eating edamame whole soy is not the problem. The problem is when you have farmers growing soy because it's subsidized, that then becomes soybean oil. Soybean oil can then be used to fry potato chips, and soybean oil costs next to nothing. When you look at corn, then we get things like corn syrup. So a lot of the highly processed foods will use corn syrup because that costs next to nothing. So therefore, you have very low operating costs, and then you can sell that at quite the markup. Whereas if you're using foods like, say, lentils or beans that are not subsidized, then your costs go up. And sure, you can mark it up 5 times the price, but then a consumer will look at that and say, well, that's too expensive. I'm going to take this product over here made from the government subsidies that costs 80% less. So that's why part of what we have to do to really solve this problem is create incentives for farmers to grow healthy foods.
I was a few years back chatting with the senior vice president of Coca-Cola. We were trying to encourage them to go non-GMO or at least label GMOs on their products at the time. They shared that they were non-GMO in Europe, but not in the United States. They use high fructose corn syrup in the United States. They don't use high fructose corn syrup in Europe. I said, why? He said, well, cost. High fructose corn syrup is subsidized in the US, but not in Europe. We could not afford to use any other sweetener because of those subsidies. So can you speak a little bit to taxpayers and the taxpayer side of this? How much taxpayer money is going to the agricultural industry? And what do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I don't know exact figures, but I know that part of the issue with government subsidies is that part of our tax money does go toward funding these kinds of government policies. The other issue, too, speaking of taxes and finances, is that there's currently corporate practices that are problematic that can be written off as business expenses. So, for example, marketing to children, a huge problem and that's why companies spend so much money on marketing to children, because it works and it's effective. But here in the US, all the hundreds of millions that you spend marketing to children can all be deducted as a business expense. So one example would be, well, marketing to adults, maybe leave that as a deductible expense, but not marketing to children. We need to have some kinds of regulations, but also laws that do relate to the bottom line and to money, because to your point, what's going to make companies ultimately change really is anything that affects their bottom line. I think it's a little bit naive to expect corporations to always act out of the social good, because part of the other problem is that part of what has also happened when you look at why has public health decreased in the last few decades. What also happened was a change where starting in the 80s, when you look at what happened with Wall Street, that's when we got into this whole thing of every quarter we have to report earnings to the shareholders. Shareholders want to see increased profits. So it's an entire system that is connected, but at the crux of that really is finances and the bottom line.
So do these companies, are they evil? Do they stay up all night trying to figure out how to kill our kids?
No, I think it's also important not to villainize or to ascribe really negative qualities. What happens is that these companies are just cog in a larger machine of a capitalist system that we have to participate in. And that's why I think the real key here is not to turn it into an issue of morality, but rather think about how can we financially incentivize, whether it's farmers or companies, to nudge them toward doing the right thing.
What goes through your mind when you see highly processed foods being marketed for kids?
When I see highly processed foods marketed to children, it's very unfortunate, because that makes me think that what we are creating right then and there is decades of unhealthy eating. That then, as a dietitian, is what I can speak to, but if you're talking about a doctor or any other clinician, you're then seeing the effects that happen after 10, 20, 30 years. And although with healthy nutrition, you may be able to mitigate some of those health problems, you're really fighting against a much larger tide. So ideally, what we would like is for children to, sure, have treats once in a while. But the problem that we're seeing now, too, is that these ultra-processed foods are now becoming the staple. They're consumed for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and snacks. So it is a relentless assault on the body.
We live in a toxic food culture, and it's impacting all of us in not great ways. But it's impacting some communities, some ethnic groups more than others. Can you speak to that and why food is a social justice issue?
Yeah, food is definitely a social justice issue because it definitely impacts different communities in different ways. One of them is through access. So usually what you'll find is that neighborhoods that are of a lower socioeconomic status, they won't have as much easy access to fresh foods. What is much more convenient, much more accessible, much more affordable will be the fast foods or the junk food. And it would make sense that if somebody is watching their spending, they are going to choose whatever hits their pocket less. And that comes back to agricultural subsidies, because the reason why a burger and fries is much more affordable than, say, a bowl of lentils and rice and vegetables is because most of the ingredients in that burger and fries come from crops that are subsidized. So really what a lot of people don't realize is that the cost of a lot of fast food meals is artificially low because of subsidies. So if anything, what we would need to do is, again, subsidize the crops that are much more healthy and that yield to fruits, vegetables, whole grains, beans, and legumes.
There was a study I read about not too long ago. Twinkies, at least at that time, had 14 subsidized ingredients in it. Broccoli has none.
Exactly.
So that's really the point that you're making. But what that does, in essence, is it condemns the poor to nutritional disasters. Other folks who have mobility, they can afford to pay more. But it's like you're being fined for wearing your seatbelt.
Exactly. And it also goes back to this idea that a lot of times what are called the social determinants of health. And we know, for example, that the zip code you live in itself is a social determinant of health. Then you can also add things like mobility. Some people may not have cars, or public transportation may not be the most reliable or the most safe. So sure, there might be a farmer's market 10 miles away, but if the neighborhood is not one that is safe to walk in at certain hours of the day, that already is a deterrent. So I know that, for example, what some communities have done as a solution is doing mobile farmers markets, because then you're bringing it to the people. But as you can see from there, these solutions are multi-layered and complex.
It's my perspective that healthy food access is one of the critical social justice issues of our times. When you look at all the implications of what ill health leads to for economic opportunity, for resourcefulness, for ability to move out of conditions of poverty. Do you see it similarly?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that nutrition and food and social justice are very closely tied together, because then, of course, you get into the fact that if somebody is eating 5, 10, 15 years worth of unhealthy foods, then they most likely will start developing chronic conditions. That could be type 2 diabetes, it could be heart disease. And then you get to the fact that usually another factor that is determined by your socioeconomic status is the healthcare that you receive. So everything is tied together, and what you end up seeing is a culmination, a cumulative effect of how your diet affects your health, and then your health may also affect what kind of jobs you could do, the job opportunities that you have, your life expectancy. Then you get into medications, which can also eat up part of your income, and then you have even less money to spend on healthy food. So it all is definitely interconnected.
I want to talk a little bit about sugar specifically. Can you just lay out for us as a dietitian, like, what is the impact of added sugars on human health?
The impact of added sugar on human health is immense. And one of the things that people have to realize is that all sugar is equal. So when I'm talking to my clients about added sugar, I specify this includes white sugar, brown sugar, raw sugar, agave syrup, maple syrup, coconut nectar. No matter what it is, added sugar is a problem because it is a source of calories with zero nutrition, which also means that it is a source of calories that doesn't make you feel full. That's why you could consume seemingly, say, 400 calories of soda, and you will still be starving after you do that. Whereas if you eat 400 calories of, say, a meal that has fiber and whole grains and beans and nuts and vegetables, those 400 calories make you feel satiated and you're not hungry for several hours. The other issue, of course, too, is that when you have high intakes of added sugar, that does also have a problematic effect, especially on the liver.
I was out for dinner with a friend recently, and she was stuffed. She was like, I can't even finish my plate. I can't have another bite. What's for dessert? There's always room for dessert. And it's true, right? Because it doesn't actually fill you up in some bizarre way.
Yeah.
Right. But it does add the calories, empty calories. We know that sugar is not healthy for us. We've known it for a long time. And yet the processed food industry seems to create some confusion around that. Can you talk a little bit about industry tactics to keep us confused about what's healthy and what's not?
Yeah, there are many industry tactics to keep us confused about what is healthy and what is not. One of them that has become especially popular over the last 20 years or so is funding nutrition research. Because we go back to policy, one of the areas of health and public health that gets the least funding is nutrition research. So understandably, a lot of nutrition researchers need funds to conduct research. And that's where food companies are glad to step in, because a lot of times what they can do is utilize part of the funding to either excuse themselves from the problem, or they can say, for example, a study we funded found that Quaker oats is really healthy. So then we get to the point that, yes, technically speaking, oats in and of themselves have many health benefits, but a lot of the processed oat offerings also have added sugar. So conveniently, you can frame research in a way that absolves you from problems. Because if the research is just looking at the effects of oat fiber on blood pressure, you can do that while conveniently omitting the fact that, well, your oat product also has a tablespoon of sugar per serving. Another thing that happens a lot is front of package labeling. This is where food companies can conveniently address certain things they want you to focus on, which is why you might see that a box of toaster pastries might talk about the inclusion of 19 vitamins and minerals, all of which are added synthetically to the product. And in doing so, it gets you away from the idea of looking at, well, how much sodium is in this? How much added sugar is in this? So industry likes that because it confuses consumers and takes away focus from things they don't want you to be thinking about.
What about animal products? We have studies showing us that animal products are not associated with longevity or health outcomes, but then we've got other studies that seem to point in other directions. What's going on here?
Well, what's happening with the animal industry in particular is that, again, the Egg Board and the Cattlemen's Association and the dairy industry in particular is funding a lot of research. Part of the issue is that the reason why nutrition can get complex is because, by and large, apart from, say, things like sugar-sweetened beverages or soda, you're never going to find a food that has absolutely nothing going for it. So, for example, it is true that dairy is a source of calcium. Now, with that being said, there's many plant-based sources as well. But what the dairy industry can do is consistently fund studies that focus more on, say, bone density in dairy products, because they know that that's always going to be kind of a slam dunk. And that's why it's important to really understand nutrition as a whole, because when you look at bone health, you realize that there are a lot of nutrients that are needed for bone health, like, for example, manganese and vitamin K, neither of which are in dairy. You will find that, though, in plant-based foods. So again, the dairy industry and a lot of the animal agriculture industry, they know exactly what they want people to focus on. And that's why so many people say, well, if I need calcium, I'm going to drink milk. And if you tell somebody that maybe you're vegan, the first thing you will hear is, how are you going to get your calcium? Because the dairy industry also has hundreds of millions of dollars to spend on public campaigns, like the infamous Got Milk campaign, the milk mustache. That was hundreds of millions of dollars. Plant-based foods don't have that kind of budget, and people may not realize that there is also calcium in almonds, oranges, and chickpeas.
What about school meals? Can you talk about how the school meal program is impacted by industry marketing and government policy?
Well, the school meal program is definitely impacted by government subsidies, because the school meal program is based on USDA policies and regulations. And, still the USDA considers dairy its own separate food group. That is completely because of dairy industry lobbying. Because if you look at the nutrition science behind it, you can have a perfectly balanced, perfectly healthy diet that completely omits dairy. There is nothing in dairy that you cannot get in other foods. But because the school lunch program is impacted by USDA policies, it is mandated that every school lunch must always have a dairy component. And also we get to the fact that it comes back to money. A lot of school districts, the first thing that gets slashed when they have to make budget cuts might be school lunch. So I do feel for schools, because they have razor thin budgets to work with. And we come back to the concept that when you're looking to save money, anything that comes from a government subsidized crop is going to be a lot cheaper.
Does the animal agriculture industry benefit from subsidies of feedstuffs?
Yes, the animal agriculture industry definitely benefits from subsidies of feedstuff. And that's why the vast majority of cattle, for example, in this country, are eating a lot of soy and corn, which is a whole problem because, for example, in the case of cows are not naturally supposed to be eating corn. They're supposed to be eating grass and hay and other things of that nature. So what happens is that when cows are living off of corn, that is not good for them. They get sick a lot. That means they require antibiotics. So it's all related. And essentially what we have here, ironically, much like humans, we have a lot of cattle that are constantly sick and constantly having to get antibiotics because much like humans, they're eating diets that are not optimal or healthy.
Can you talk to the issue of antibiotic-resistant bacteria and its impact on public health?
Absolutely. More and more what doctors are finding is that a lot of bacterial infections are becoming antibiotic resistant. And a large part of that is because we have such a large presence of antibiotics, even though they're a minimal amount in the food supply. So another reason why when we have these controlled animal feeding operations or CAFOs, part of the issue is that we have a lot of sick animals that require antibiotics in order to stay alive so they can be essentially used for their meat or their byproducts. And then that ends up getting into the food supply. And antibiotic resistance is something that even the World Health Organization has recognized as a global issue that needs to be addressed.
Can you speak to the outsourcing of costs through environmental harm and public health harm that comes from CAFOs?
Yeah, there are many costs that are felt by communities, especially ones that live around the concentrated animal feeding operations. You'll often hear stories or read stories about, especially with waterways. So a lot of times this runoff or the waste ends up getting into the water, and then you have entire ecological systems that collapse, or you have entire ecological systems that go off balance. And many people, many communities, and again, that goes back to food justice, because usually the people in the communities who live around the CAFOs are usually low income. And when you measure the air quality, for example, especially those who live very close to concentrated animal feeding operations with pigs relating to pork, the air quality is terrible. These people can develop asthma. So there is definitely a cost that is felt, especially by those immediately surrounding the area. Usually people of lower income who have fewer people advocating for them. So it becomes another issue of environmental health tied to food practices.
Yeah, and really environmental racism at a certain point, right?
Correct.
Can you speak to pharmaceutical industry funding of medical research and why that creates, that doctors can prescribe, for example, a drug that has massive side effects and insurance will reimburse it, but they can't prescribe, foods that are actually maybe even better for people?
Absolutely. I think the issue of the pharmaceutical industry funding medical schools and medical curriculums is a problem, because often what happens is that a patient might go in to see their clinician with things that can be fixed through food. Now, I'll be the first to say there are some things that do require medication. If you get bitten by an animal, you have an infection, you will need antibiotics. But I'm talking more about the chronic conditions that always come up as a public health top 3: blood pressure, heart disease, and type 2 diabetes. A lot of doctors, understandably, in their curriculum are not taught the medicinal effect of food. They will always learn about prescribing a medication. So somebody might go in with heart disease and they'll be given a statin. Although we know that from a nutritional standpoint, there's something called medical nutrition therapy for that reason. You can manage heart disease, you can lower cholesterol, you can lower triglycerides, you can even lower blood pressure simply by changing your diet. But most doctors, are not aware of this, so they prescribe medication. The other problem is that most doctors, because they're not aware of the medicinal effect of food, may not even think to refer that patient to a dietitian for nutrition counseling. And so then what we have are people taking medications, but of course medications have side effects. So a statin for 5, 10, 15 years, it might lower your cholesterol, but it might impact another organ. And then over time, you're going to need another medication to take care of that organ. And then you have what's called the polypharmacy effect, where many people over the age of 60 are now taking 6, 7, 8 medications, all that may impact one another. So I do think that one of the things over time that would be tremendously helpful is to revolutionize what the medical curriculum looks like. so that at least every doctor has some exposure to nutrition as a tool. My understanding is that right now in the US, 20% of medical schools at most offer any kind of nutrition. And in the vast majority of that 20%, we're talking about 2 hours over the span of years. Only about 5% of medical schools have a solid nutrition class. But I think it's really vital to get doctors on board about the healing power of food.
And dietitians, of course, are uniquely positioned there.
Yes.
But even the Association of Nutrition and Dietetics has a sordid history when it comes to objectivity relative to the processed food industry. Can you speak about that?
Yes, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics does have a bit of a sordid past with industry. In fact, I created a group back in the 2010s called Dietitians for Professional Integrity. And what it did is it brought forth this topic of the fact that at the time, the National Association of Dietitians was being sponsored by Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, and the dairy industry. Over time, that has stopped and it's gotten better, but that is a huge issue because essentially what that would mean is that these companies had access to dietitians. They would be at the national conference and they were able to really do a lot of their public relations work directly to dietitians, partially making their products seem innocuous.
To your knowledge, does the AND still invest in the stocks of processed food companies as part of its investment portfolio?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. As of a few years ago, they did. And as a public organization, that's something they have to reveal.
Interesting.
Which is rather disturbing, I think.
Absolutely.
Because they then have an economic stake in the status quo.
Yeah, and I think another problem that comes when you have a nutrition association funded or sponsored by the food industry is that then that leads to, for example, the Academy has a position paper on a balanced diet. And they make a point of stating that there's no such thing as good or bad foods. Now, I do agree that we don't want to demonize people for eating what they eat, but I think that the nutrition science certainly shows that some foods are recommended to be eaten frequently and other foods should be eaten sparingly, if at all. When we give this false equivalency, everything in moderation, my response is, well, not everything in moderation, because you could eat 2 apples a day every day, but you wouldn't be drinking 2 sodas a day every day. But if we make everything seem like everything is equal, that only confuses the public even more.
Yeah, I'm not going to give my kids just a little bit of methamphetamines. Because
Exactly.
everything's okay in moderation.
Exactly.
There's some things that are not okay.
Yeah, and some things should be encouraged, and other things should be discouraged.
Some people say there's good for you foods and there's fun for you foods. What goes through your mind when you hear about that concept?
Well, the idea of good for you foods and fun for you foods, my understanding is that PepsiCo came up with the idea of fun for you foods as a way to use a euphemism for maybe unhealthy foods or hyper-processed, ultra-processed, or junk foods. Now, I do think that there are some foods that I say are relegated to celebrations. So, for example, cupcakes, sure, at a birthday once in a while, at a wedding, not a problem. But the problem is that by and large, a lot of these foods like cupcakes are especially marketed to children as snacks that can be eaten every day. In your lunchbox, there's, a brownie as a snack. So the problem is that we have to make sure that we understand that it's not about saying never, ever, ever, but some foods really become a problem when they're eaten on a daily basis. And most of what is marketed to children is unhealthy, and it is marketed as an everyday food when it really shouldn't be.
Why do kids' taste buds like sweet things?
Well, all humans like sweet things. We are all wired to enjoy sweet things. It's partially why so many people like fruit. Ironically, as a dietitian, vegetables might be harder to get people to eat, especially the more bitter ones like arugula or kale or dandelion greens. But by and large, everybody likes fruit, which is great because whole fruit is very healthy. And that's because we are naturally wired to enjoy sweet things. So apples, bananas, oranges, strawberries, kiwi is great. It also means, however, that we can also be wired to eat hyper-processed foods with a lot of added sugar.
Can you speak a little bit to the ultra-processed foods? What are ultra-processed foods?
Ultra-processed foods are ones that are extremely processed. So for example, if you take an apple, A whole apple is completely unprocessed. Nothing comes of it. Now, if you take the apple and you peel it and you make applesauce with it, that's slightly processed because you are removing the peel, which has a lot of fiber, a lot of nutrients. But really, all you're then doing with it is just mashing it into applesauce. So you are removing some parts of it, but you're still generally eating the fruit generally whole. But if you then take that apple and you completely process it to then make an apple toaster pastry, that is hyper processed because you are not only processing the apple, but you're also adding oil, fat, sugar, and salt. So hyper processed foods, ironically though, are also highly palatable because they often add fat, sugar, and salt to make them more addictive, to make them tastier, and to make the taste buds explode. It's also why a lot of people who are eating diets high in ultra processed foods initially struggle a little bit with healthier eating because the taste buds have to get used to less salt, fewer chemicals, fewer flavorings. But hyper-processed foods are a problem for that reason, and also because we know that the higher the intake of ultra-processed foods, the higher your risk of developing things like type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, and heart disease.
Curious if you could speak to shelf life and how that affects food industry, retailers' experience as well as food manufacturers.
Shelf life is a very important component that food manufacturers consider because the longer the shelf life of a product, the less waste, and the less waste, the less money that also goes out of your pocket as the company. So for example, if you have a product that can only sit on shelves for 3 days and then it doesn't sell, that is a lot of money that you are wasting. Whereas if you can make a product that can sit on shelves for 6 months or a year, that is better for your bottom line. And how do you do that? Usually not only by adding chemical preservatives, but sodium is one of the oldest preservatives in the world. And that's why a lot of ultra processed foods are very high in sodium because it helps to preserve shelf life. And we know that high intakes of sodium do correlate with higher risks of developing high blood pressure.
So in some ways, this is kind of one of the costs of a global supply chain of foods that sit on shelves for long times, but also travel all around the globe. You can only do that with things that are not very perishable.
Exactly. The only way to really have a global food chain, especially one that is unhealthy as the one we have now, is with foods that can travel great distances, sit on trucks for weeks, not even be refrigerated. And those are the foods that we know can be the most problematic from a health standpoint.
So if you were king for a day or longer, and you could make some changes to policy and practice of industry and government to support a more sane relationship to food, what are some of the things you would love to see? Or what are some of the things we could do that would give us more hope and health?
So the first things that I would do if I had the power to make changes to food policy or agricultural policy would be, number one, I would completely change agricultural policy so that there are financial incentives for farmers to grow healthy foods, specifically fruits, vegetables, beans, legumes, and whole grains. Number two, I would make marketing to children illegal. That would include advertisements on media, but also as far as getting the cartoon characters out of the front of the package of unhealthy foods. I would also, for example, prohibit companies like Disney from having their characters on a box of unhealthy cereal. And I would also not allow marketing to children to be a business deductible expense for companies. What I would then also do is make sure that local communities have budgets to create local initiatives that make healthy eating easier. I think one of the things that can often get people or make people feel a little defeated is that a lot of these problems can seem insurmountable because people think about them on the federal level. But that's why I encourage people, instead of trying to fix the entire country or the entire state, focus on your local school district or just your county, because those are easier conversations to have. You can also talk to your local Congress people about what you can do directly in your own community, because then that can have an effect over time, and it's much more manageable.
A few years ago, I was talking with a vice president at Nestle, and she said to me, "I'll be honest with you," as if this was some great surprise, "our products are not exactly healthy." She said, "We've made a focus to get affordable foods that are tasty available to as many people as possible. What we find is that when we make our foods healthier, lower sodium, lower added fats, more whole foods, less sugars, they don't sell as well. And if we go out of business, that's not doing anybody any good." And I got the catch-22 of that. Of course, one of the issues there is that they're using subsidized ingredients for their junky foods. But what do you think we can do to make it easier for companies like Nestle to do the right thing?
Well, and this is where I think it's important to keep the bigger picture in mind, in the sense that I think what needs to happen with the food industry is that I actually don't encourage a lot of these minor tweaks to make processed food healthier, because that only makes the problem worse. Case in point, several years ago, a lot of these cereal companies were adding whole grains to their sugary cereals. And it became the whole thing that they could then advertise on their boxes, now made with whole grains. But the fact remains that it's still an ultra-processed food, very high in sugar. So I'm not a huge fan of trying to say, well, can we add a dust of oat flour to Fruit Loops? Because all that does is give the food companies leverage to say, well, look, now we have Fruit Loops with 2 grams of fiber instead of 1 gram of fiber. I'm more of the belief that what we need to do is keep these foods as they are, but market them in a way that doesn't make them sound innocuous.
Do you think that we should have some kind of warning labels on certain foods like we do on cigarette packages?
I do think that warning labels on foods would help. Other countries have done them. In other countries, they do have, for example, a very clear label saying this food surpasses the recommended amount of sugar you should eat in a day, or this beverage has more sugar than you should drink in a day. It's not going to be as explicit as the warnings on tobacco because, again, it's very difficult to find evidence that this particular food has absolutely zero benefits to it. It's easier with cigarettes because there are zero benefits to smoking, and smoking is not necessary. We all need to eat. But I think that just being much more transparent in front of package labeling is one strategy that may work.
What about produce prescriptions? What would happen if doctors could prescribe fruits and vegetables or other healthy foods and actually have them reimbursed?
I think that reimbursing healthy foods or having doctors prescribe vegetables would be fantastic. And that's an example of an initiative that has been done in some local communities. But again, the way to really get to that is by changing agricultural policy. So a lot of this really comes back to the Farm Bill. Now, the Farm Bill is a very complex document. It's hundreds of pages. It gets into inside baseball. But that is really where you see agricultural policy. And again, that comes back to you could start at the local level by advocating, by speaking to your Congress people, many of whom, understandably, are unaware of the link between agricultural policy and nutrition. So again, I'm not of the belief that there's, this shadowy group of people who are all trying to make us sick and rubbing their hands together. A lot of it is that this topic, unfortunately, tends to take a back seat to things that people focus more on. Understandably, it could be crime, it could be education, but that's why it's important, if you have the knowledge, to try to communicate it to the right people who are then inside government to make things happen.
Do pesticides concern you and the use of pesticides in agriculture?
The use of pesticides in agriculture mainly concerns me from a food justice standpoint, in the sense that I really worry about the workers who are the ones who are exposed to these chemicals. Now, sure, I'm not a huge fan of necessarily eating a lot of pesticides, but when you look at the fact that studies that are done on conventional produce that do have some pesticide residue still shows that they have health benefits, My main concern is for the communities that are living in the area, the farmers who are the ones exposed to the chemicals, because all these pesticides end up accumulating in the land, in the water. So from an environmental and social justice standpoint, that does concern me. And that's another example where industry has a huge say. We have a lot of industry dollars at stake that don't want pesticides to be banned or utilized less. And they're often the ones lobbying in government.
Tell us a bit about farm workers and their reality and, their vulnerability and how they're treated.
Farm workers are very vulnerable, often because many times they are undocumented. And that already sets up a power dynamic that's very uneven, where because they're undocumented, they're much more prone to be intimidated or told that, if they speak out or if they do something, they might get deported or whatnot. You also have the issue, for example, when COVID first hit, one of the industries that got really hit by it was the meatpacking industry, because you had all these workers in very tight quarters. They don't have good health care. They don't have sick days that they can take. So they were going into the plants already sick, infecting one another. And so a lot of it too is making sure that food workers across the board have good health care. They can take sick days. That's one of the main issues from a social justice standpoint as well.
If somebody wants to eat food that is ethical, what are the top things to look for?
One of the foods that has the most ethical concerns is actually chocolate. There is an entire slave trade that has to do with chocolate. Now, there are some organizations, one of them is called the Food Empowerment Project, that has a list of slavery-free chocolate. Now there is also some certification that you can find on the packaging. So really, it's by informing yourself. So one of them is looking at the kind of chocolate that you're buying. And then also making sure that you're following organizations that focus on farm workers, because they can also let you know, which crops are more prone to maybe underpaying the workers. I know that for a while there was an issue with the coalition of Immokalee workers, I think in Florida, who were picking tomatoes, and they were able to unionize and ask for more fair wages and fair labor. So a lot of it is, that's information that you have to seek yourself. Because a lot of this you won't necessarily find, in the produce section information, but a lot of it really stems in produce in particular.
I don't want to get too deep into immigration politics because that's a pretty hot topic, but actually I am curious. Do you think that the agricultural industry has an incentive to maintain a status quo in which large numbers of undocumented people are available for easy exploitation and therefore kind of likes the open border but with undocumented as a status?
Yeah, that's not my area of expertise, but what I will say is that when you look at the vast majority of agricultural workers in this country and the vast number that you need, there's a reason why so many of them are undocumented. And I think that if that were to change, the agricultural industry probably wouldn't have the numbers they need to keep that amount of food being produced.
And is it fair to say that they're paying people well under minimum wage in many cases?
Yeah, one of the many issues that happens in the agricultural industry is that when you have a workforce that can be easily subdued and intimidated and controlled, you can pay them unfair wages. And that goes back to food justice. I think another one is making sure that everybody across the food chain is being paid a fair wage. And we have seen it more recently, of course, with the fast food employees, and that's great. We now need to ensure that that's also happening with the ones out in the fields who are responsible for procuring and growing and harvesting the food as well.
I'd like to get to a few nutritional topics and get your feedback now, pulling out your dietitian hat.
Sure.
So can you tell us a little bit about omega-3s, omega-6s, and omega-9s and what we need to know about them?
Yes. So when it comes to omega-3s, 6, and 9s, the first important thing is that of those three, two, the omega-3 and the omega-6 are what is known as essential fatty acids. Essential in this context means that you have to get it from food. Omega-9 is not an essential fatty acid because the body produces it itself, kind of like how the body also makes cholesterol. That's why cholesterol is not an essential nutrient. But omega-3 and 6 you have to get from food. Now, part of the issue is that for optimal health, you want a balance of omega-3 and omega-6. The average American diet is very high in omega-6, largely because you find that in seed oils and soybean oil and corn oil, and very low in omega-3s. So omega-3s are found in chia seeds, flax seeds, walnuts. Now, if you do eat fish, you can also find it in fish. The only drawback with fish is that while some fish contain omega-3, you're also, number one, there's an environmental impact of overfishing. And also with some fish, you have the pollutants in them, because as they eat other fish in the food chain, they end up getting all these PCBs or other components that are not the best. So what I often recommend to my patients is an easy way to get omega-3s. Make sure that you eat chia, hemp, and ground flax on a daily basis. Or also include walnuts in your diet as well.
The animal products industry often refers to itself as the protein industry. They will literally refer to, themselves, replace the words meat with protein. What do you think about this sort of branding, and where's it coming from, and how effective is it?
The animal agriculture industry very purposefully tries to equate its products with protein, because then it makes it seem like they're the only sources of protein. Now, it is true, of course, that animal products offer protein, but protein is abundant in the whole food supply. You can get protein from vegetables, from whole grains, from beans, legumes, nuts, and seeds. So you can get plenty of protein without ever eating a single animal product. But the animal industry has worked hard on referring to their products as protein, much in the same way that the dairy industry has done a job of making it seem like dairy is the only word that is synonymous with calcium.
What do you think about all the meat and dairy alternatives that are using the same words? For example, plant bacon. Or, for example, plant milk. And is there an effort by the animal products industry to squelch that?
As far as the plant-based equivalents to meat and dairy, there are a few issues worth talking about. One is that the animal industry has been trying to prevent these products from using those words. A few years ago, there was a whole lawsuit against Miyoko's butter because the dairy industry didn't want it to use the word butter. They ended up losing that lawsuit. But it's because the animal industry is seeing, especially with the plant-based milks and the dairy products, they are losing a lot of revenue to these products, and not even necessarily to people who are vegan, but even people who are more health conscious or even omnivores who are more plant-based. And I do think that it is important to use those terms because that's the easiest way to help people understand what they're eating. When you say plant bacon, people know, oh, okay, so it's going to taste like bacon. I would use it like bacon. If you tell people, oh, these are seitan strips, the average consumer has no idea what that means, what seitan is, how do you cook it. So I do think it is important to refer to things as vegan or plant-based, butter, milk, cheese, yogurt, or whatever it might be.
I'm curious what your take is on the nutritional pros or cons of the various replacement products that are coming on the market, some of them very high-tech and highly processed. Are they a step in the right direction, or are they a step in the wrong direction, or what's your take?
I think that meat analogs are a mixed bag. On the one hand, they have made it so that now vegan alternatives are more easily accessible. There used to be a time where if you wanted to go eat out and have vegan food, you had to go to a vegan restaurant. Now you can go to a variety of restaurants and they'll probably have one of these imitation meat burgers on the menu. So in that sense, it helps. These foods can also serve as what I call bridge foods, because a lot of people do need a bridge to go from ultra-processed omnivore foods to completely whole food plant-based. So these imitation meat products, imitation chicken, imitation cheese can definitely simplify the path. However, they are still highly processed and not the most nutritious. So they should not be seen as the equivalent of a whole food plant-based patty, for example. It's not the same as a black bean burger that's much more nutritious. But I think they play a role, but they should not be the final destination.
I want you to envision with me for a moment a world in which whole foods, plant-based options, culturally appropriate, are the norm all around the globe. What do we have to look forward to in such a world?
The number one thing that we could look forward to if the whole world were largely whole food plant-based would be a significant decrease in chronic diseases. The top three, again, being heart disease, high blood pressure, and type 2 diabetes. In turn, that would place much less of a burden on the healthcare industry. That would free up so much more money that could be invested in other things and used for a variety of uses, whether that is environmental initiatives or simply making healthy foods more accessible to people. But the number one effect would definitely be on human health. And then, of course, there would also be a huge effect on the hundreds of millions of lives of animals that would be spared and saved.
Andy, you're a fountain of insight, inspiration, and wisdom. And thank you so much for all your articles and research and work, plunging into some pretty dark places, but also always knowing that it's for the purpose of bringing light into that darkness and illuminating the truth so all of us can make healthier choices and hopefully build a healthier society for everyone. We've been talking with dietitian Andy Bellatti. Thank you so much for joining us.